Good morning and welcome to Rose Red Homestead. Today is Retro Friday and we are going to be doing freeze drying versus dehydrating. And I think that this is an important difference that we need to understand. I know there are lots of people out there who really wish they had a freeze dryer, and I just want to tell you that for Jim and me, it took us 5 years to save up for getting our freeze dryer, and we haven't had it that long. We've only had it, I don't know, maybe 6 years, 5 or 6 years. And so for about 30 years, I used a dehydrator, and I love a dehydrator. I always get asked, which do I like better? Well, the answer is I really appreciate what both of them can do. And I'm glad I have both now. I got along with just the dehydrator for all of those years and didn't think I needed anything else. But the main advantage for me for having a freeze dryer is that we can do things like dairy. I don't particularly care for the way that it does some meats, and you can't do meats in a dehydrator, but we have other ways of preserving meats. And so if you are thinking about food storage, it is really a set of redundancy systems where you can use different types of equipment for different types of preserving of your food. And if you have some redundancies, then you can pretty much preserve anything that is preservable. So today we're just going to focus on dehydrating and freeze drying, and I'm going to explain to you what the difference is. So I have some examples here. We're going to get to those in just a minute. First, I'm going to introduce you to my freeze dryer and my dehydrator model. So I wanted to just discuss for a moment how a dehydrator works, and then we will compare that with how a freeze dryer works. So dehydrator is generally a box, a rectangular box, or they also make them circular with circular trays. But the mechanism, the physics that it uses to dry the food is pretty much the same. Food is spread on trays, very similar to this one. Now, this is how mine came. This is probably the 4th or 5th dehydrator I have owned, and so far I like this one the best. I just wear them out. And we had a great big one once from Cabela's, a big industrial one, and it lasted only about 3 years. I was so disgusted with it. But this one is I'll put the link to the one that I use. And the one that I use is just one of many that would be very acceptable to use as a dehydrator. Dehydrators are much less expensive than freeze dryers are. But you arrange your food on a tray like this. One of my previous dehydrators had these little covers, and I just kept those when I threw the dehydrator away after it gave up the ghost. And so now I use a combination of this when I use food that could ordinarily fall through the cracks. And you can get solid pieces that go on the top too to do fruit leathers. So dehydrators are very versatile in that way. And they come, some version of this, either rectangular or round. I used a round dehydrator when I was first starting out. I think that may have been the first type that came on the market way back. I ultimately gave one of those round food dehydrators to each one of my children. We had a family tradition of making jerky for Christmas, and as they would leave the nest and go out on their own, I always gave them a dehydrator so that they could continue making jerky in their own homes. So the way that a dehydrator works is, briefly, it simply has a motor that creates heat, a fan that moves the heat, and some way of exhausting the wet air as it pushes that hot air, moves through the cells of the plants or the food, and evaporates the water. The air on the inside becomes humid, but it gets pushed out of the vents wherever those vents are. Now, sometimes the motor is on the top, and generally that is the circular kind, where you stack up the circular trays and then the motor goes on the top. Motor can also be on the bottom, where you stack the trays over the motor and the fan. Since I have used both types, I can tell you that I much prefer the box type, like this one. That's what my current one is. And well, as you can tell, because the trays are almost square, they're not quite square. On mine, the motor is in the back, When the motor is on the top or on the bottom, as you can guess, it is easier for the trays that are closer to the heat source to dry the food faster. And so a lot of times you have to take all those round trays off and reassemble them, reorganize them so that they all get a fair share at getting the heat. With the rectangular one, it's not so much. It's a little bit that you maybe have to turn the trays from this way to this way. So my motor and fan are in the back. Heat comes from the back and it blows across all the trays, and then it vents the air out the side. What happens to the food cells in dehydration is the food cells start something like a little cube, and as the water evaporates, the cellular wall collapses and it becomes just a fraction of the size that it was to begin with. Those of us that have used dehydrators know exactly what that is. And they become hard, leathery or hard, and it takes longer for them to rehydrate. Sometimes a really long time for them to rehydrate. Now, our freeze dryer sits up like this. The inside that freeze dryer, there is a cylinder that fits in just like this. And that cylinder, the trays fit inside that cylinder. That cylinder creates a vacuum chamber. So what happens when you freeze dry food, the first thing that you do is you load the food and put it in and close the door. There's a big gasket, so the whole thing becomes a vacuum chamber. But the first thing that happens is the temperature just drops like a stone, and it gets down to 30 below to 40 below. It just freezes that food way, way, way cold, below zero, below freezing. And that preserves the cells in the structure that they went in with. The cells inside the food are now very rigid and frozen in place. Then what happens with the vacuum? When the pump turns on and creates that vacuum, the vacuum lowers the atmospheric pressure inside the chamber. So an amazing thing happens. We want the water out of those cells, but we don't want it to evaporate and leave the cells squished. But what happens in that particular circumstance where it's cold, 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 and there is a vacuum in place, as it starts to heat up, the ice crystals inside the food sublimate. Just like dry ice, it doesn't go from solid to liquid to gas. It goes from solid ice crystals to gas, water vapor, and that's called sublimation. And then as the sublimated water vapor escapes the food, it settles on the inside of the vacuum chamber along the walls. The chamber itself is metal, so that when we're done, the food is dry. The water from the food is ice on the inside of the chamber, on the walls. It's out of the food. So that is good. And so then it continues to dry until the food is about 98% dry, and the nutrient content of the food is at about 97% of its original nutrient content. And so that's one reason to love freeze-dried. Also, the other reason is that the cell structure of the plants does not collapse. It stays tall and rigid. And so we have done several videos on comparing how one food does in the dehydrator compared to how it does in the freeze dryer. And those are the videos that we're going to be presenting to you today. Now, this week's Retro Friday sets up next week's Retro Friday, because some of the foods that we did back in 2021 and 2022, when I was hot to do all of these things and could do the food comparisons in both pieces of equipment, I was also powdering vegetables and doing some pretty cool things with those too. And that's what next week's Retro Friday will be, is how we use the powders that we make from either the freeze-dried or the dehydrated vegetables. So I went outside this morning just to see what I could find. You know, we rotate through things pretty fast. And one of the things that I have discovered with a lot of experience is that dehydrated foods deteriorate much, much quicker than freeze-dried foods do. This is celery, and I'm going to hold it up here so you can get a good look at it. It is, I just found it. I didn't even know that I had this. But this is what it looks like. And I won't ever use this. It is way beyond its best used by date. Dehydrated foods last about a year before they start looking like this, and their flavor and the nutrition is completely gone. And so I'm going to lose a little bit of the celery that I worked so hard for. I think this is probably from the celery. It was in March of 22 that this was done. And I believe that that is when the video that you will see on freeze drying and dehydrating celery, I believe that this is the remnants of that 4 years later, and it's going in the trash. Now this is some Rotel, some tomatoes and green chilies. That Rotel kind of a hot sauce that comes in a can, a 10-ounce can. And I freeze dried and dehydrated. This is the dehydrated version. I've already used up the freeze dried version, but this is still good. It will still work, even though it's 4 years old. I should probably test that before I make a claim. It is fair. I would probably use this depending on some recipes, but not all recipes. It has 4 years old. The taste is there, but it's still a little bit gone. One of the things that does hold up really well are fruits. Now we have used all of our dehydrated peaches, so all I have are the freeze-dried version that we put up in August of 21. And these are still way good. And notice that it just still looks like a peach. It's crispy like a cracker. Still, taste is wonderful. So I like the freeze dryer because it preserves food for longer. But there are some things, and this is just another container of peaches. The label has peeled off, so I don't know what year these were. They don't look quite like these. These were not dehydrated. When you dehydrate them, they collapse down and they get thin and leathery, but really good. And I can eat fruits dehydrated to the leathery stage or freeze-dried, either one. I do not like freeze-dried bananas, banana chips. I really do like dehydrated banana chips. And so as you gain more experience, you just learn what works well in which. And both are just excellent. But I do really appreciate having the ability with a freeze dryer that I can freeze dry things like eggs and buttermilk and yogurt and sour cream and all the dairy things that I certainly cannot do in a dehydrator. So the videos that I have for you are preserving peaches, and that was, I think, this video where we did dehydrating and freeze drying, and then we powdered some. Then I did drying and freeze drying broccoli. That was in 21 as well. Dehydrating and freeze drying Rotel tomatoes. Rotel tomatoes, that was the one that I showed you in 22. And then dehydrating and freeze drying celery. And that one I particularly did so that we could powder it and use in some of our powdered soup recipes. So enjoy these videos and watch to see how we powdered them. And then next week we'll follow up with powdering and some soup recipes with the dried powder. So enjoy, and thank you for watching this Retro Friday, and we'll see you again very soon, and especially next Friday for a follow-up on this one.